Hoi! With the new season, Season 5, we're not only getting a bunch of changes in general, we're also getting a new set of artifacts. And I want to talk a little bit more about the balance of these artifacts, what I think about them so far, which one I think are strong or weak or in between, and how they could be useful. The first one that we're going to look at here is Sin. The description on the page itself is that you have Corruption as the perk. Debuffs last 25% longer, and this works on both weapons. So initially the patch notes for this also included Defile, specifically for the hatchet. That has since been removed. I am pretty sure now that Defile is just a general perk, which deals 2% more damage per debuff on a target with a maximum of 5 stacks. In case of Sin, the other two perks would then be Keenly Jagged and Refreshing Move. I believe that Sin's passive has niche applications. I think that in particular for Void Gauntlet, or for general debuffer builds, there could be some degree of value here. It definitely needs to be checked if debuffs actually includes all debuffs. For example, if they're counting dots as debuffs as well for the purpose of this effect, which, you could assume in either direction based on how New World is wording things, but also based on how things sometimes go in New World. So I'm gonna be patient here and we'll just see. That would obviously determine the value somewhat. That said, I think it's definitely going to be niche just based on the fact that Hatchet and Void Gauntlet, for example, as a combination aren't particularly common or particularly popular. Hatchet in general is not particularly popular, and I can't really think of any combinations where you would see massive immediate returns out of this, where there's like a must-have for this effect. Again, primarily thinking of war debuffers here, but in any non-war situation, I think you don't put as much value on having those debuffs up on the target that you would literally sacrifice another artifact in order to get this. So I don't think this is bad, but I think it's a weird hatchet or a weird weapon choice for that with the hatchet, and I think that the combination that arises from that is relatively uncommon. And I would not rate it that highly for most players in terms of what they would generally want to use. I also find it kind of weird that this is essentially the second hatchet that's more focused on the debuffing side of things, or the right side of the tree, the other one being focused on throwing, but both are tied to the right tree with not really much going into the left side so far. I think as a pure focused on the debuffs only hatchet itself that you could pair with a normal melee weapon, I don't see all too much value in that. Like, sure, having the debuffs for the rend and the infected and everything, disease last longer is not bad, but it's not enough for me to be like, okay, this is a very strong artifact. Next, we have Venom, the Spear. This has a perk called Poison Tipped. Heavy attacks with either weapon cause poison damage, dealing 20% weapon damage for 5 seconds. Now, this one comes in combination with a fix that is very important. In the same patch, the bow has been fixed so that all heavy attacks on the bow now actually count as heavy attacks and not as light attacks as they did in the past. So that means it can actually proc Venom, and that obviously is the primary contender here, the primary obvious example of how you'd want to mix this, running Venom with a bow. And I think for that purpose it's very strong. I think it gives you a lot of extra damage. If you're running Spear offhand anyways, might as well go for this. Obviously this is not the only option that you have for offhand. So it's more of a, like comparing that to say using Life Taker, it's more of a question of what do you really want to have in your offhand. And I think for many bow users, if they had the choice between equally efficient options, they would go for the Spear and the offhand, obviously, or the Rapier. That's what it's still going to be competing with the finisher. But I do think that there is use cases for this. Likewise, that is not the only option to use this. You could also use this with a Greatsword, for example, so it will have value there. So for the less war-focused side maybe of things, but more the casual-ish side or small-scale PvP side, where people like to focus on their own damage, I think there's already big value in Venom by itself. But then we also need to look at the perks of the weapon, and I think that makes it even more interesting because it seems that the locked perks here are Transient Crits and Transient Strikes, which is an illegal perk combination and means that this thing will do a whole lot of damage with a heavy attack. Now this annoys me somewhat because Scorpion Sting already had heavy attack focus as one of his perks, and I think Spear is more than just heavy attacks. I think they should enable other playstyles instead, same as I'm saying this with the Hatchet. But what I will say is that in this case, I think this combination can be very strong if you're going for a sweep build, if you're going for the coup de grace, because that applies heavy attack effects. So it's really just to deal a ton of damage with this one single thing on the spear, and then you would just go into a bunch of other perks that also work with heavy attacks on the spear and just fully focus to build around that, and in that moment you could get some value out of it. Again, you could also combine it with a greatsword, but it has to compete with the Serenity at that point, which is a tough challenge at least, because that also has an insane amount of increases in itself. And yeah, I don't think with the spear, other than the coup de grace, you would really be heavy attacking that often. But that may also change slightly with the combat overhaul. Maybe heavy attacks will connect a little bit better or something, and maybe they'll make heavy attacks a bit more valuable. Or, what I think is even more important to keep in mind here, is the future in which we may be seeing a change to heavy attacks where you can move while heavy attacking. This is something that the devs have talked about, that they're trying to implement at the moment, seeing if that is something that they can make usable and fair. And if that was the case, then obviously a lot more weapons would be heavy attacking a lot more often, and this artifact would generally gain a lot of value. There could also be some other niche scenarios, like using this with a fire staff, for example. I don't think it would work for the AoE part of it, because I don't think that counts as a separate heavy attack, but I think it would be working on the primary target. Or yeah, maybe some other niche uses where you would use heavy attacks on weapons where you normally maybe don't, or maybe with a Warhammer. There are certain things where you could use this. There's niche cases, that's what I'll say, and then there's also some more general cases. So overall, I think, especially with the bow fix, I think Venom is a fairly strong, small-scale PvP artifact. Maybe even usable for wars if you're really focusing on the coup de grace damage aspect of that. So yeah, I definitely rate this as one of the stronger options of this patch. Next in line is Tempest Fury, a Greataxe that has two perks. The first one is the one that's listed here, which is Momentum. Successful attacks gain 3% movement speed for 3 seconds, and this works on both weapons and stacks up to 10 times. The secondary perk is Endless Spin. Whirlwind spins an extra 10 times. I'm not entirely sure how this works with the changes that are being done to Whirlwind, where the first 4 hits actually don't need to connect, so I don't know if the extra spins here need to connect or not, and if they are after the other 3 extra spins or not, or whatever. But either way, that is a very interesting combination. So I think Whirlwind is kind of misunderstood based on what it does and how it sounds at first glance, essentially. So a lot of the information that you have about Whirlwind is about, it's AoE, it's spinning, it's doing ticks, and it gets more damage the more enemies around you, so you get all your value if you go into a big clump with it. Which is not wrong, that is definitely the case. If a clump is clumped enough, often they won't be, and often you don't get that much value out of it. You get an insane amount of value out of Whirlwind in small-scale PvP. That is because you can hit someone with a light attack, you can track onto them, and you can follow it up with Whirlwind, and you can stick to them, and it is incredibly difficult to cut loose of that unless you have a very strong CC or a very strong escape. And with this extended spin duration, with this increased movement speed, both on momentum and from the keen speed that is on the weapon as well, that is going to be very, very hard to get away from. Now, there's also Fortifying Whirlwind on the weapon, which I think is a bit unfortunate, because the increases on that aren't that great compared to many other perks. Like, I'd rather have a Refreshing Charge or Crippling Reap there, while the bonus here is the Empower part is often overcapping anyways, and Fortify, yeah, sure, whatever. If someone's running from you, you're not going to care much about Fortify. If you are in a clump and you're getting focused, sure, different story, but in a clump, it's also easier to interrupt Whirlwind, or stun Whirlwind at least. So, I do think that technically Whirlwind can be very good, and I think that the Greataxe conceptually can support that, because it can support exactly this chaser playstyle where you just spin on an enemy constantly and they're just trying to get away and they don't know how. It's just kind of conceptually similar to Flamethrower, actually, and for some reason people seem to underrate just because the base damage is 50% or whatever. It's just, it doesn't seem like enough, but it's especially funny in trade with a flamethrower when the flamethrower player is suddenly like, wait a second, the other guy's doing the same thing, but it's somehow doing more damage to me because he's fortified and he's getting that extra damage. So yeah, I'm a big fan, I'm a big defender of Whirlwind. I think the problem with Whirlwind is that the cooldown is way too long. 30 seconds is just Grafwell levels of cooldown, and it just has to compete with other abilities with a 20 seconds cooldown that can do a lot of stuff quicker. So that's where my big issue with this is, and that's why I think even though Tempest Fury sounds cool, it's not going to be that cool. It's my impression so far anyways. It might have a flamethrower moment where people are actually really frustrated dealing with it, and it turns out to be worse than we thought. But I don't think so far. I think that the perks that they put on it are just not very strong either. They're not very threatening. You probably drop like a... Well, it depends on where you're going to use it. Either you drop some extra damage with Thwarting Strikes on it, or you put Rogue on it if you want to use it more for chasing or something. Maybe also Vicious as like a middle ground. And that's the only damage perk you get. And I like having an ability perk on Greataxe. I think there are a lot of good ability perks that you can put on your Greataxe. But I do like to have some extra damage at least along with that, which you're not really getting with Keen Speed. You can't really put any plague effect on it either that way, which is often a problem, especially in small scale PvP. So yeah, I like the concept. I don't like the perks. And I think it's a bit too focused on the movement speed aspect of it, which is otherwise not bad. And obviously I also like the fact that you have that movement speed increase across both weapons. I think there's a lot of use cases for that. It's especially an amped up Keen Speed that won't really drop off that much because it works on both weapons, stacks up to 10 times. So even if you're swapping between weapons, it should stay up. You just have to have Plagued on your other weapon if you need that, I guess. But yeah, I am kind of a fan. I just wish they would buff Whirlwind itself a little bit after they already nerfed it a little bit for small scale. Nature's Wrath is a medium chest, which is with Nature's Blessing. And power expires 200% faster, but you deal 20% more damage. I'm assuming this means 20% more damage during empowers. It's not clear if this is like an extra 20% empower, or if this is a base damage increase, or what exactly this is. So this one is a very big question mark to me. I could maybe see this being good for weapons where you just have a very high empower restacks. Maybe even like on a Greataxe, maybe you can make the uptime work so well that you don't have to worry about it. Generally, I think this seems very niche. It does also mean that, but then again, if it's actually 20% in power, you wouldn't even care on a Greataxe. So again, depends a lot on how this is implemented, and I think it could be interesting for like really high burst in some situations, on like maybe a Fire Staff, for example. It could work well, especially if your empowers are not tied to you, but to something around you. I think thinking of Fire Staff, I think that applies for Roots of Healers. I think that just stays on the ground as long as it does. And from the top of my head, I want to say that's an empower. I'd have to check. And then there's another few empowers. I think surrounding Fire Staff, as well as Void Gauntlet, for example, with Oblivion. It would also have that situation where you just get that empower and you keep it as long as the ability is active. So that helps a little bit there, but then I think there's more important things. For example, on a Void Gauntlet, I don't think I would sacrifice this artifact for another armor artifact. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's very niche, very weird, but maybe someone will find a very interesting way to use it. Maybe like Void Blade users or something. But generally, I wouldn't put it all too highly for now, unless somebody finds the super cracked way to use it. Gilli's Gravity Gauntlets is a heavy glove that comes with the charged perk. Whenever you take damage, you gain an empower charge that increases the damage of your next attack by 3%, with a maximum of 10 charges. The empower is not mentioned on the website post, but it's actually mentioned on the artifact. So we know this is empower, which already means that this is not quite as great for certain builds. This is kind of similar to Jasper in many ways, I guess. It comes with health and enchanted ward along with that, so not bad perks at least. That's another discussion in itself. Some people like health still, some don't. I think it's still valuable, especially if you're not talking purely about wars. I think there's absolutely value in it. Enchanted ward, likewise. So I do think that this could be useful in terms of the base perks, but I don't really see all too much value for this charged effect. I think the amount of damage that you need to take in return for the amount of extra damage that you're really going to deal with a bit more in power doesn't seem worth it very often. It might work with ticks, because it says whenever you take damage. It might work with like dots, flamethrower ticks, ice storms, that kind of stuff. And if it does, that I think would increase the value somewhat, because you could proc it fairly consistently against, for example, flamethrower users, which would overall, in my opinion, increase the value quite significantly in some situations. But yeah, I'd still think it's rather niche. Maybe you could like make it happen in wars if you're like surrounded by enemies and you're taking constant ticks from a bunch of stuff, and then maybe you just very frequently get that in power on some weapons. But again, like depending on the weapon, you might not even care. So weird one to me. I gotta put a big question mark here, because it really depends on how exactly this charge gaining will work, and depending on that, it might be a bit stronger or weaker. But it doesn't stand out to me as like an insanely strong one at the moment. Ironheart is heavy legwear with steady foundation. When not in a heavy loadout, you gain 20% more maximum health. You'd have to run a loadout with a heavy leg and heavy chest setup, which is a bit unconventional, because like that's the only way you could effectively use as a medium, but it's possible. It doesn't really lose many stats or anything in that regard, so very much doable. And I think this is a very interesting one. I don't know how exactly they are going to calculate the 20% max health, like if it's just based off your base health pool or actually your entire health pool. That would, of course, make a difference already in how effective it is. But either way, I think this could be at least a contender that could be considered in certain scenarios. Obviously, it depends a little bit on if we're talking small scale or bigger scale. What you're competing with here, primarily is going to be Dark Voidplate, I think. Occasionally it might be Tumblers as well. I think that's kind of falling out of favor for the most part, though. So yeah, depends, but I do think that this health increase may, in many situations, overall result in more value than just having the armor. You kind of have to compare it like based on the individual situation, because it depends on how much health you have exactly, what amount of damage you're taking, what armor value you have, blah blah blah, what kind of damage you're taking. So it's not like a simple answer that's the same in every single situation, but I do think that 20% health is enough to make a difference. If we compare that to just having a health perk in itself, that's a massively increased value. So we're talking 20% here versus a single health perk on armor having 2.4% increased max health. So yeah, it's pretty much 8-ish of the health perk around that. Or you could throw together maybe the health from Amulet plus a couple of the normal health perks, and even then, you'd kind of be stretching it. Like 5 health perks and the Amulet is around the same amount as this pool here. So that's a pretty big increase, and like people still value health. Again, it depends on how exactly it stacks on top of that as well. I'm assuming it's not going to be fully multiplicative, but rather additive with those. But anyways, I do think of all of the artifacts, this is definitely one to keep an eye out for, and we'll see how good exactly it is. But I will definitely do some testing with that, do some number crunching once we have both available to actually verify how exactly it works, and that should be very interesting to me. Creed boots are light footwear with the ambush perk. Deal 15% more damage and 25% critical chance as long as you haven't hit the target within 20 seconds. Locked perks are refreshing and freedom. So not exactly safe perks there either. My feeling here is that this is going to be used by a handful of very aggressive players, maybe Firestaff, for sure the deck side of things. I think some musket players will use this, maybe some bow players. But other than that, I think it's a big sacrifice to make. You're giving up on a lot of other good artifacts that you could consider for this. And you could still get decent increases from other artifacts, like you could get tumblers instead, and that would still be pretty good. I'm not entirely sure, once again, what exactly deal deal more damage means in this context. But yeah, if it's just a 15% empower, we can get the same from Tumbler, minus the crit chance. So yeah, I think overall not that big value. Exact value depends on how they scale it. But it seems like such a big sacrifice because it's only once every 20 seconds per target. It could be interesting because it's per target, like how it handles in AoE situations. Like if you're mage bombing a point, maybe that could be interesting. But again, I don't think this is going to be super high value unless we go into such a hyper aggressive meta that everyone just gets popped instantly. But that was about the only scenario where I could imagine that. Phoenix seems very strong to me. It's an amulet that comes with Phoenix Revival. When you receive lethal damage, avoid death and become invulnerable for 2 seconds with a 3-minute cooldown. Along with that, it also comes with Purify and Stamina Recovery, which is an illegal perk combination, giving you both a cleanse for all debuffs every 90 seconds, and also gives you the Stamina Recovery when below 50% health every 30 seconds, which is just a massive combination. I think Purify's cooldown is way too long compared to Stamina Recovery, which always made them kind of, like, made it an easy choice to go for Stamina Recovery just because the cooldown is so much shorter. But between those two perks and then also having the Phoenix Revival effect every 3 minutes, there's a lot of survivability in this one. You do lose something. You either lose health or you lose protection. But I guess you can offset that. Like if you, for example, go for a protection perk and you say, okay, but for health, I'm going to run the heavy legs with the extra health, and that kind of balances it out. That's an option. It, of course, depends on the scenario. Like in a scenario where you're using Ankh as a bruiser, you're not going to care about this very much, I think. But for most scenarios that are not that, most scenarios where you're using other artifacts, I think this is very strong. I think there are just a lot of jewelry artifacts that are kind of niche, that don't really have a general purpose, but rather cater to specific playstyles, like Blood Drinker, for example. And this seems like the opposite of that. This seems like this is just a free safety net for whoever you are. Why not? Like, absolutely very much worth it for squishies, like for healers, I'd say for range players in general. Also very much worth it for tanks, where this can mean like, okay, the tank is finally going down, but now he's immune to damage, and now the healer has a chance to heal him back up. Though the question is if you can get healed back up while you're invulnerable. I'm not exactly sure how that will work. But either way, that part, and then on the other hand, everything in between is kind of more of a question mark. But if you're not using Ankh, if you're in a smaller scale combat scenario, 3v3 or something, I don't see why you wouldn't want to use this. I think there's just so much benefit in this effect that you can often kind of find around. Though, of course, it depends, right? Like, if your enemy learns to play around it, it's a different story to some degree. But then, even then, like, you can learn how to use the fact that your enemy is playing around it. I think it's very, very strong. I think it's very much on the top end of artifacts that we have so far. I see a lot of value in it. And yeah, I think of all the artifacts here, that's the one where I would say with the most certainty that this is definitely going to very easily find its place for a lot of players, because it's a very all-rounder one. Maybe less than others in PvE, but even in PvE it's like a noob saver at least, so it's nice for that too, I guess. So yeah, I think Phoenix very much up there, and it's still a bit weird to me that they are introducing an effect like that after taking it away from the hatchet. So quite a lot of different artifacts here that are interesting to some degree, others that I think are a bit less interesting or very, very niche. And we'll see what happens on PTR and test them out and see how they actually work, if some will get buffs or nerfs, and what other perks they have. If you're interested in that, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you get notified when that comes out. If you'd like to support me further and get early trading tips, then you can do so on Patreon. Thanks to my patrons who already do exactly that. And thank you for watching. SLOTH out.